Good afternoon. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to have you with us here in the William G. McGowan Theater for James Wright to tell us about his book, Enduring Vietnam, An American Generation and Its War. I'm glad you could be with us this afternoon, whether you're here in the theater or joining us on YouTube. Before we go any further, though, I'd like to tell you about the programs we are presenting in this theater later this month. On Thursday, November 16th at 7, the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress will be our partner in presenting a panel discussion on the topic Vietnam, Lessons Learned and Lessons Ignored. A bipartisan group of former members of Congress will join experts on the Vietnam War to examine the tumultuous Vietnam era. On Wednesday, November 29th at noon, historian Edward Ayers will discuss his new book, The Thin Light of Freedom, the Civil War and Emancipation in the Heart of America. Ayers retells the story of the Civil War by focusing on two counties, one in Virginia and one in Pennsylvania. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events online at archives.gov. Check out our website to sign up to get email updates. You'll also find information about other National Archives programs and activities. Now I ask all Vietnam veterans or any United States veterans who served on active duty in the United States Armed Forces at any time during the Vietnam era, November 1st, 1955 to May 15th, 1975, to stand and be recognized. Do we have any veterans in the audience? Welcome home, and thank you for your service. As you exit the theater today, National Archives staff and volunteers will present each of you with the Vietnam Veteran lapel pin. On the back of the pin is embossed, "A grateful nation thanks and honors you." The United States of America Vietnam War Commemoration is a national initiative, and the lapel pin is the nation's lasting memento of thanks. Last Friday, the beginning of the Veterans Day weekend, we opened a new exhibit, Remembering Vietnam. I encourage you all to walk through the exhibit, if not today, then another time in the coming year. Remembering Vietnam is a media-rich exploration of the Vietnam War, featuring interviews with American and Vietnamese veterans and civilians with firsthand experience of the war's events, as well as historic analysis. It's a fascinating look at newly discovered and iconic original documents, images, film footage, and artifacts that illuminate 12 critical episodes in the war that divided the peoples of both the United States and Vietnam. The exhibit draws on National Archives records from all parts of our agency, federal, civilian, and military records, presidential libraries, still photography and motion pictures, sound recording, and electronic records. Remembering Vietnam could have told the story of the Vietnam War by relying solely on those records in our holdings, but a key part of remembering is remembering the people who lived through it and hearing their memories in their own voices. The numbers involved are impressive, of those who served in the military, who were wounded, and who died, but we must remember that every number actually stands for a person. And during the Vietnam War years, so many of them were young, in their late teens and 20s. Enduring Vietnam recounts the experiences of the young Americans who fought in Vietnam and of families who grieved those who did not return. While doing his research to write Enduring Vietnam, James Wright interviewed more than 160 veterans and families, including me. He tells the story of a generation, why they went into the military, what it was like to serve in Vietnam and to come home again. James Wright, a Marine Corps veteran, is President Emeritus and the Eliza Wheelcock Professor of History Emeritus at Dartmouth College. He is the author and editor of several books, including Those Who Have Borne the Battle. His efforts on behalf of veterans and education have been featured in the New York Times, Boston Globe, National Public Radio, and more. He serves on the boards of the Semper Fi Fund, the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, and the Campaign Leadership Committee for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund Education Center. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome James Wright.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Thank you, David, and I'm delighted to be here today. I'm long been a fan of yours, David, and what you're doing with this very special national resource. This facility is really the Fort Knox of the Republic for historians and really for all Americans who recognize the treasures of our heritage. David, you and your colleagues have nurtured this well while positioning it in a changing world. I first worked in the National Archives over 40 years ago, and I recall taking notes with note cards. For my Vietnam book, though, I accessed the databases and files online, and I found them very helpful and very accessible in helping me to try to understand this story. And I also want to thank you, David, personally for allowing me to interview you for this book. Your own Vietnam experience was an important one. I'm also thankful to Doug Swanson for his work and patience in arranging for this program. Now, with the Burns and Novick series this fall, with the exhibition here, we've had an opportunity to engage again with the Vietnam War and to try to understand better the experience of those who served in Vietnam. And this exhibition makes that service, that experience, palpable. What a wonderful contribution to our national understanding. And I do hope this afternoon in my few comments here, I can modestly contribute to that ongoing conversation. My book, Enduring Vietnam, aims to describe the Vietnam experience of that American generation who served there. Let me share with you a little bit of how I approached doing this. Last year, just about a year ago, my wife Susan and I attended on Broadway a performance of Hamilton. And many of the lines in that play struck me, but one of them kept running through my head. Eliza Hamilton, the widow of Alexander Hamilton, sang, along with a chorus of founding fathers, "Who lives? Who dies? Who tells your story?" I thought of this simple set of questions that she posed a lot, and indeed I have used it to frame most of my conversations about my book over the last several months. At the time I saw the play, my book was essentially finished, but I knew that her lines summarized well some of the very questions that I had wrestled with over the previous years. In any armed confrontation, the first questions that she raised are the determinative ones. Who lives and who dies? Apart from all other descriptions, this is the fundamental question. This is the tragic consequence. Indeed, and we must never forget this, killing or being killed is the cruel purpose of war. That's why I've had such trouble with the boots on the ground metaphor that some politicians and pundits have used in recent years. Some 99% of the population of this country has no personal engagement or stake in our wars. It's easy to abstract these distant conflicts to drones fighting video games or to little mimetic boots marching around. And I keep pointing out we are not talking about shoe leather. We're talking about flesh and blood, and we're talking about our young who serve. and we send them to war zones, we're asking them to confront the question, who lives and who dies? But then the burden continues after the shooting stops, is addressing the lingering question, who tells your story? The shared narrative of battles and wars fought, of those who served and those who sacrificed, is critical for the framing of the story. This National Treasure House here and other libraries and archives contain the records that enable the telling of the story. I'm delighted that Bernie Edelman is here today. His book, Dear America, is a remarkable compendium of those stories, carefully selected and enduring stories, I would say. It's the task of historians and others, and storytellers, really. You do not have to be a professional historian, but storytellers to work through these records and to try to tell the story. And that work can only be enhanced by encouraging those who experienced it to share their experience, as Bernie has done. It's incomplete without this. Historians can write sweeping judgments and tales of the Vietnam War, some remarkable stories, some necessary stories about decisions made here. But you have to get out on the ground and understand the consequence of serving there to be able to tell the full story. The story of war provides an account of a life lost. It can remind us of who this was, and it can mark forever the lives of the survivors who knew them and carry the memories, and indeed the survivors who carry with them their own experiences from war. But then telling the story is a burden that we all share. And we have an obligation, I think, to make certain that these become embedded in our national narrative. This is an important part of what I've tried to do with the book, to remind readers of the human face of war, to remind readers of the human cost of war. The shadow of the Vietnam War still hangs over us. The human costs of the Vietnam War endure, as does the debate over the decision for the war, the conduct of the war, and the results of the war. These things hang quite heavy. But the story of the war, the human experience, this becomes abstracted and shuffled aside in these great debates about the war. And let's face it, in the debates, the debate points are pretty consistently negative ones. I'm not trying to make them positive, but I would say those who serve there deserve better. As paraplegic veteran and public servant Max Cleland wrote in 1972 during the presidential campaign, when Senator Edmund Muskie described the war as a mistake. Cleland was then a young veteran. He asked, "What do you mean, a mistake? What's the meaning? Where's the purpose? What does that do to a guy like me who lost so much? What does it do to all those who lost so much in Vietnam?" In telling the story, my interest has certainly not been to try to justify the war, but it is to insist that we need to know the experience of Vietnam from those who were there before we can ever begin to understand that war and its consequences. I interviewed 160 people for my book. I called them my collaborators, and I sent each of them a personally inscribed copy of the book last spring. One of them, as I indicated earlier, was David Ferriero. We talked about his own thinking, his own reflections when he joined the Navy, knowing that he would likely be going to Vietnam, and his experience as a Navy medic in Vietnam, including serving on the USS Sanctuary, which was a significant hospital ship off the port of Da Nang. He and the others shared with me many personal stories, powerful stories, largely of combat experiences or of combat consequences. And they affirm my belief that in so many cruel and perverse ways, there is nothing more human than war. It tests our courage, it tests our values, and it tests them instantly. There's no time for reflection, for thinking about, should I do this? It's instinctive. But even though I depended so much on veterans, one account by a family member who did not himself serve in Vietnam is powerful. This is somebody who was a 15-year-old kid in Pennsylvania in 1969. There was a knock on the door of his house, and there were two soldiers in uniform there, in dress uniforms. They asked if his parents were home, and he said no, they weren't, but they were running an errand and had just called and would be home shortly. They asked if they might wait, and he said of course, and they said they would just sit on the porch and wait. He told me how excited he was to have them there, and he went out to talk to them. He said, I have a brother in the Army. Do you know my brother? My brother's a helicopter pilot. He's in Vietnam. We just got a letter from him last week. He's coming home next month. I can't wait to see him. Do you know my brother? And he ran in the house and he got a picture of his brother and brought it out and asked him again, do you know my brother? He was surprised. He admitted that they were very non-communicative, didn't really want to talk to him. And as you will have assumed by now, when his parents came home, they learned that his brother would not be coming home, that his helicopter had been shot down. And so this man that I interviewed said that he ran up in the woods behind the house after he learned this and just wept and wept and wept. And he said part of it was for grief about the brother that was not coming home, and part of it was embarrassment for continuing to ask these soldiers, do you know my brother? As a sidebar to this, the father asked the soldiers what day his son had died, what day his helicopter had been shot down. They said on June 6th. This was in 1969. The father said, June 6th, I guess I'll never forget that day. 25 years before that, 1944 is when I went ashore at Normandy, June 6th. My book does provide a history of the war. I am a historian. It's important to set the context and to frame the world of the Vietnam generation. Now, I have to say I'm not very kind to those who sent them to war. The presidents who were involved in this seldom shared their own doubts, and they had serious doubts about how this was going to work out and was it really the thing to do. They allowed politics and ego to dominate too often, and their candor and their honesty were set aside. But I have to say I'm less interested in critiquing the nation's leaders than I am in assessing the view of the world that they stressed, the view of the world that the baby boomers learned. The baby boomers, those of you who grew up in the 50s, was a world of expanding opportunity. We were told regularly, you can do anything. Work hard, study hard, and you can do anything. And we were also told in the 1950s about the constant threats, about doomsday, underlined by duck and cover drills in the schools. I grew up in a small town of around 4,000 people on the upper Mississippi River in western Illinois, an old mining town. We had duck and cover drills in the schools, as if somehow the Soviet Union was going to come out and release atomic bombs over Galena, Illinois. The baby boomers grew up in the world in which John Kennedy reminded them of obligation. At his inauguration in 1961, he exhorted, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." Now, if this sense of a shared responsibility for the Republic seems quaint in 2017, those of us of the generation can say it did not seem quaint in 1961. It seemed to be the world that we knew and the values that we knew. President Kennedy's generation, the baby boomers' parents' generation, the World War II generation, they talked about accepting the torch of liberty. Kennedy specifically said this at his inauguration. They accepted the torch of liberty, and they very quickly handed along this torch to their children. The grand vision of the post-war world played out in the jungles of Vietnam. What an unlikely place for this to happen. One of my favorite stories is from Colin Powell. He first was deployed to Vietnam in January of 1963 at a time when we had only advisors there. We had only advisors and also had some special forces troops that were certainly engaged in missions, but they were largely advisors at that time. Powell was sent to a base camp up in the Oshawa Valley near the Laotian border, and this is the far distant reaches of the old South Vietnam, up south of the demilitarized zone and near Laos. He had orientation on the base, and he asked the South Vietnamese commander there, the ARVN commander, why the base camp was located at this place. And the Army of the Republic of Vietnam commander said, well, this base camp is here in order to protect that airstrip down below. And Powell looked down again at this grass airstrip down below them, a short field, but one that could take small aircraft and helicopters. And he said, okay, I see. But then he asked, but why is the airstrip there? And the South Vietnamese commander said, well, the airstrip is there to supply this base camp. And Powell thought about that, and he would later reflect that despite a second tour in Vietnam during heavy combat in 68, 69, he wasn't certain that he ever heard a better explanation of some of the tactical deployments in Vietnam than the circular logic of this one. In 1965, when the American ground war began, Lyndon Johnson sent troops in. First Marines came into Da Nang in March of 1965. For the next several months, the dominant public image of those serving in Vietnam was clearly of young heroes fighting communists someplace in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Within a few years, as American casualties increased significantly, as we were sending more and more troops in, as the draft picked up, as stories came back of horrible experiences there, including those involving the killing of Vietnamese civilians, most of them at that time described as accidental killings, certainly. Many people back here came to consider those serving in Vietnam as objects of sympathy, fighting a cruel and an ill-advised war. The protests at that time were directed at the nation's leaders, and some of us will recall that the chants were, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? But after the story of My Lai became public in December of 1969, in the minds of some Americans, those serving in Vietnam became instead the perpetrators of that cruel war. as drug-addled psychotics. Lyndon Johnson was back at his ranch in Texas, and for some protesters, those serving in Vietnam were cruelly called now the baby killers themselves. It became what I've described as the Apocalypse Now War. I describe that movie in my book as Vietnam meets Woodstock. It may be a good movie. It's not history. It's not a story of the Vietnam experience. Now, I have to say, I made that comment at a gathering out in Burbank, California last spring, and one of the first hands up from the audience was somebody who was saying, wait a minute, I was a screenwriter for that film, and we worked very hard to make certain that Apocalypse Now was an accurate depiction of the war. And I did not engage with him in a debate over that. I have said that Apocalypse Now describes the Vietnam War in ways similar to the way the Broadway play South Pacific described fighting in the South Pacific during World War II. I think it's tragic that in the 1970s, more Americans likely knew the name Lieutenant William Calley, who led the AmeriCal unit that massacred the civilians at My Lai. And perhaps as many as 600 civilians were killed there. It was murder. It was a massacre. More knew him than any others who fought in Vietnam. I can certainly affirm there were many heroes in Vietnam. There were many instances of heroism in Vietnam. But think about it. There are really no publicly acclaimed heroes. Surely those who were released from the prisons were heroic. But if you look at the ground war and those who fought there, how many of them became publicly acclaimed heroes that are wrapped in our national narrative of that war? Now, it's hard probably to provide thrilling, heroic accounts for a war that was not embraced. I would argue, though, that service, the willingness to stand up and serve, and the heroism of the battlefield is even more compelling in such a war. Think of it. Knowing full well that people here did not respect that war, they went off to serve. And I think it's more worthy of gratitude. The dedication to my book reflects that. I wrote, this book is dedicated to that American generation who honorably served in the Vietnam War. And this book salutes those who sacrificed. Their stories deserve to be known and their lives remembered. The difficulty of this American generation's war and the controversies it engendered made their willingness to serve and the sacrifices that they made the greater and not the lesser. I'd just take a moment to share with you a few examples from my effort to reflect on the days of that war, to reflect upon the very human experiences of the Americans who served, and to introduce a few of those who died there. One was not somebody who died, but whom I came to depend on greatly. It was Don Sullivan. Don Sullivan graduated from Boston College and got his draft notice in 1967. He went down to the Army recruiting station to check out his options, and they said, well, he had a college degree, he could become an officer, he could go to OCS. And he said, yes, but I'd have to serve 1 or 2 additional years. Why would I want to do that? And the recruiting sergeant said, I'll tell you why. You can either be inside the officers' club drinking a cold martini, or you can be outside the officers' club walking guard duty for those who are inside drinking a cold martini. What would you rather do? Sullivan decided he would become an officer. I'm not certain that if he ever had a cold martini in Vietnam. He had plenty of warm beer, I understand, but not a cold martini. He went into Hamburger Hill on the first day. Hamburger Hill was Dong Ap Bia. The Army the 187th of the 101st Airborne went in there on May 10th, 1969, and they would fight for 11 days before they reached the top of the hill. The assumption was they could be on the top that afternoon, and it turned out this was that place where the North Vietnamese, well dug in bunkers with tunnels and with supply coming readily from Laos, because it was just a few miles from Laos. They were able to supply this base, and they decided to fight there. Don Sullivan told me many accounts of that battle, but one that stayed with me was of a young kid from Minnesota, Buck Dufresne from the Twin Cities. I also interviewed Buck Dufresne's sister and a high school teacher of his. Buck Dufresne was a sergeant in Don Sullivan's platoon, and they went out on the 14th on another assault up the hill, and they were hit by a rocket which seriously injured one of the men in the unit. Buck Dufresne immediately organized a litter party to take him down the hill. Hamburger Hill was so steep, it was really hard for medevac helicopters to come in at that angle, and besides, there was so much shooting down from the top that it was just difficult, impossible. So they had landing zones down below, a little bit clearer, a little bit flatter for them to come in. And Buck Dufresne organized a party to take them down. And just as they started down the hill, they were hit again by another rocket. It killed the man on the litter, it killed everybody carrying the litter, and it seriously wounded Buck Dufresne. Don Sullivan said, "We'll get another litter party, we'll get you out of here, Buck." And Buck Dufresne said, "Lieutenant, I'm not going to make it." He said, "Yes, you will. We're going to get you down. We're going to carry you to a hospital." So they got another litter party, and Don Sullivan remembers well, and other people who were there that day that I interviewed told me as well that they remember this strong, powerful voice of this young Army sergeant as he's being carried down the hill. "Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home." Buck Dufresne did not survive to the bottom of the hill. I was with Don Sullivan last week up at his hometown in Winthrop, Massachusetts. He asked me if I would come down to his hometown library, and we had a program there coming into Veterans Day weekend, and I talked about Hamburger Hill and the battle and what we were doing, and he talked about the consequences of that. He talked about PTSD and what he had dealt with over the years, now 48 years since that battle on Hamburger Hill. I also tell the story oftentimes of Jimmy Hickey. Jimmy Hickey was from Quincy, Mass. He was part of an Irish Marine culture in Quincy. In fact, he was going to drop out of high school as a junior with some of his friends and join the Marines and go to Vietnam, where the action was. He was just 17, high school junior. He finally agreed to delay doing this. His girlfriend pressed him to delay, and his family did. But the following winter, during the Tet Offensive, one of his dear friends who went in with that first group was killed during the Battle of Hue. And Jimmy Hickey was deeply troubled and moved by that. David Pitts was only 18. So Jimmy and 4 others dropped out of school a month before their own graduation from Quincy High School, and he joined the Marines. He was in Vietnam by early 1969, and he died in May on Hill 55, northeast of Liberty Bridge. It's an area that the Marines who served over there called Dodge City. There's a square in Quincy named in honor of Jimmy Hickey, and at last count there were 19 other squares in that city, remembering young men from that city who died in Vietnam. Jimmy's uncle, Phil Burns, wrote a poem, The Magic Horse, about Jimmy that I reprint in the book, as Jimmy's sister shared with me the poem that was read at his memorial service, his funeral. When Jimmy Hickey was young, he insisted that he had a magic horse. He tied it up by his bed every night, he said, and it protected him and it took him to some wonderful places. Mr. Burns' poem concluded, "Dear Jim, I'll lead you home upon your magic horse." The poem evokes Peter, Paul, and Mary's Puff the Magic Dragon. Dragons live forever, but not so little boys. The other day I spoke at a ceremony on the USS Constitution, and I told the story of Jimmy Hickey there as a Massachusetts boy, and a Marine veteran in the audience came up to me afterwards and said that he was back from Vietnam and was at the Naval Barracks in Boston in 1969 and was part of the Marine Honor Guard that went out to be at Jimmy Hickey's funeral where this poem was read. I tell the story of Lenny Hickson. Lenny Hickson was one of a set of triplets born on the Navajo reservation, the first recorded triplets born there. And after he graduated from Window Rock High School, he joined the Army. He was a paratrooper and a machine gunner and was recognized by his buddies for his generosity and his strength. Lenny Hickson carried their loads when they needed help. He sacrificed his sleep and finally his life to look after them. He died in a night attack. One of his buddies wrote to Lenny's parents, "What a privilege to have known such a man." He was buried at Fort Defiance Cemetery on the Navajo reservation, and following a Catholic funeral, the Navajo elders performed their ceremony there for this young warrior. One of his triplet sisters threw herself on the coffin and begged to be buried with her brother. I tell the story of the young Iowa wife. She and her husband were college students, and they're both very much opposed to the war. And he finished and got his draft notice, and she begged him not to go, said, "Let's go to Canada." And he said, "No, that wouldn't be fair. If I didn't go, somebody would have to go in my place. But I promise you I'll never shoot anyone." He later would volunteer, though, to go to Vietnam, and he did this because his wife was pregnant, and he knew that those who were being deployed to Vietnam had a 30 days leave before they went, and the timing would work for him to be home when his son was born. He was killed in a night attack when he was deployed around a hill position. And his wife told me of just how enraged and angry and grieved she was when she learned this. And the Army sent an honor guard in to be at his funeral. And she went to the honor guard the day of the funeral and said, "No 21-gun salute, please. No rifle fire. There's been enough gunfire around my husband. I don't want any more." Obviously, the Army respected her wishes. I just saw, actually, last week, the Des Moines Register had a story about her and her husband and his service in Vietnam. Larry Boyer grew up out in Elwood City, Pennsylvania. He was a star baseball player. He was so good that Major League Scouts were following him, even in high school. He went to Marietta College in Ohio, and after 2 years there, playing some very good baseball, with scouts still watching him, he dropped out to join the Marines. Larry said it was his responsibility. His father, he said, still carried scars from his own World War II wounds. He needed to serve. His generation needed to serve. Larry and his good Marine buddy, Burl Bailey, from Omaha, they call Burl Bailey Beetle, of course. They were on patrol out on Mutter's Ridge. Mutter's Ridge is just south of the demilitarized zone. And Beetle Bailey was walking point. He turned a corner and was shot. Larry Boyer ran up to try to help his friend, and he was shot as well. They both died there on that trail. Larry's sister Sandy said, "At times I wish we never would have grown up. Dragons live forever, but not so little boys." I tell the story of a patrol boat veteran. A good friend of his had been killed in an ambush, and of course these patrol boats, the swift boats down in the Mekong Delta, they were basically inviting an ambush, and then they would fire back and be able to take out the enemy. They got hit by some rifle fire, and they came back with major firepower against them, and there was a big explosion over in the bush where the fire had come from. They obviously had struck an ammunition dump, and two enemy soldiers, their bodies went up flying in the air and came down. He told me how all of the men on the ship celebrated that and did whatever the 1960s version of a high five was after seeing these bodies fly through the air. He told me about how he bragged about that back at the base, indeed, for a few years after he came out of Vietnam. And those little bastards' bodies went flying through the air, we got them. But then about 10 years after he returned home, he was at a church retreat down in the Shenandoah Valley. Part of the retreat was for them to walk alone through a maze and reflect on some things in their lives and how it related to their spiritual lives. He told me that while walking through this maze, he was suddenly overcome thinking about this, thinking about his service in Vietnam, thinking about those two bodies flying through the air, and how pleased and happy he was, how they congratulated themselves. He said he realized in that moment that killing the enemy is part of war. If we hadn't killed them, they would have killed us. But he said, these men probably had family back home. They may have had pictures of their children in their pockets. They too were God's children, and one should never celebrate killing God's children. And he wept and he wept. He finally said he had to leave the maze because he didn't want people to see him crying so heavily. He went up in the woods, and he told me never again after that date did he ever feel good about killing enemy in Vietnam. I interviewed veterans who described their unease about coming home, their concern about confrontations. One veteran wrote in his book of walking across the campus, Fred Downs wrote about walking across the campus of the University of Denver and had his prosthetic hand with a hook on the end. A student on the campus came up to him and asked if he had lost his hand in Vietnam. When Downs said yes, the student replied, "Serves you right," and walked away. Downs said he was too confused with hurt, shame, anger to even react to this. Most veterans who came home encountered debilitating indifference, the sounds of silence. Families greeted them warmly. They were wonderful, glad to have them home. Their friends in the community greeted them warmly. But seldom did anyone ask them about Vietnam. Now, you have to realize that most of them probably did not want to talk about Vietnam at that time, but they were hurt by the lack of interest in what had been such a profound experience. Some of them said they even quit entering their service experience on their job applications, because in the 1970s and this period after My Lai and all of the stories coming out of Taxi Driver movie, many people feared they were psychotics. On the TV show Kojak, Telly Savalas was confronting a series of brutal homicides in a neighborhood of New York City. He told one of the detectives on his team to find out if there are any Vietnam veterans in that neighborhood. PTSD is a companion of all wars. Read Odysseus, and you'll see a full-length reflection on this. It was not even diagnosed as a clinical condition, though, until 1979. Before that, veterans with problems were categorized as suffering from the Vietnam syndrome, as if this was something specific to that Vietnam experience. World War II veterans told them to grow up and get over it. The instances of World War II veterans dismissing the Vietnam generation as a bunch of whining kids, a bunch of hippies. They said, we did, we got over it. But of course we know that those World War II veterans did not all get over it. It was called combat fatigue or shell shock then. During the Civil War, it was called soldier's heart. The Vietnam veterans would speak to me in our conversations about nightmares, and nightmares then becoming daymares, as one described it. They couldn't even escape them during the daytime. One said, if those people had to spend just one night inside my nightmares, they would fall to the floor with tears in their eyes. Think of this, and it's as good a way, I think, of describing and summarizing this. This is the face of war. This is the heart of war, the memories, the tears of war. And these are the stories that I think so badly need to be told. We need to remember and to recognize what this generation did. Over 40% of the baby boomers served in the military. There are more of them with the names on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall than went to Canada or went to prison for evading the war. That generation is not asking for sympathy. They're not asking us to remember them only as suffering. In fact, that generation has gone on to do some quite remarkable things for this country. But they remember. In fact, they have no choice but to remember. They can't forget, and so should we. And I think all that they're asking of us is to know, to recognize their service. They're dismissive, some of them, of the sort of thank you for your service. They find it platitudinous. As one said to me, it's like somebody saying, God bless you after you sneeze. They no more imagine God is going to bless you than they are really thanking me for my service. It's just sort of the thing that they say. In the play Hamilton, George Washington, the old soldier, sings along with Eliza Hamilton. And George Washington sang, let me tell you what I wish I'd known when I was young and dreamed of glory. You have no control. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story. So my book represents my effort to contribute to the effort, to the obligation to make certain that the stories are told. The exhibition here is a remarkable contribution to that effort, to make certain that the stories are told. Ken Burns and Lynn Novak's series should enable all of us to think about and to reflect on that war and the meaning of the war for those who served. So my thanks to all of the veterans who are here. I thank you for your service and your sacrifice. But all of us, veterans and non-veterans, need to join to tell stories. Even more importantly, to listen to the stories and to learn from the stories. These stories echo here in this exhibition. And maybe by learning a little bit more about these stories and about these experiences, we can hope that someday more Americans can answer affirmatively the question, do you know my brother? Thank you very much for joining me here today. Thank you for inviting me, David. Thank you. And Doug, I think we're going to do questions. We have microphones available. If people would use them, that would be great. Thank you so much for giving me your lunch hour. I enjoyed this opportunity to share this with you. Thank you.